Hi, welcome. I'm here with Kalli Retzepi, who is a designer and technologist, graduate of the MIT Media Lab. She is deeply invested in network technologies with a particular focus on the browser as a space of interaction and intervention. She's concerned with developing critical design for network space in particular, considering it both from a UX, UI perspective, but also as a medium to develop new ways of thinking about culture. So welcome, Kalli. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you, Ryan.
Whatever here really means these days.
Yeah, somewhere between.
Somewhere between, yeah. So we're here to talk about projects and ideas that were happening in our Digital Economies lab. And you had an interesting arc as you were working through some of the ideas. Early on, you brought some ideas together and with the group that became the Offer Need Machine. But you, along with Macy and Julie, were really thinking very broadly about the ideas of ecology and mushrooms in particular. How did those ideas around trying to rethink the nature of networks through these ecological and sort of material metaphors come to be? How did they sort of come into your practice?
I think it's important to say that I generally like seeing technology or tools in their, not necessarily under the guise of what they were designed to do, so very literally. And in my practice, I've always been interested in using / misusing tools or technology or different conventional ways that people have about solving problems. And I think that for me, I've always been really, not just me, I have been curious in the history of the internet and the web and the history of networks that, as we conceive of them in the 20th century, which is a very technological medium, because the network is, throughout humanity, the idea and the concept of a network is omnipresent. But specifically when it comes to the web, I've been curious about the history and essentially the way it came to be. And I think that to the mushroom and the more natural ecology point you make, I think that there's always a lot of similarities between networks that have been built by people to networks that have been built by nature. And actually, I think that most networks are built by nature in a way. And basically, in a way, the way we design and implement human-made, man-made networks very closely mimics often the networks created and operated by nature, which is basically the reason life exists on this planet.
So what was it in particular about, I think, in terms of thinking of mycelium networks, what was it specifically about those things? Because I think the idea of ecological metaphor of thinking of an ecosystem and a network is not. We've definitely heard of that, and it's something that we can easily imagine these two things having a kind of rapport. But mycelium networks is not something many of us are that familiar with. So what in particular was it about that?
We were interested in mycelium networks, but we were also looking at the World Wide Web, which is a term for how trees communicate. All this, I didn't know all these things before starting working on this and doing research. And those two, the mycelia and the wood-wide network, are actually very intimately connected because the mycelia are the ones that do the signaling, underground. Initially, we kind of gravitated towards that direction because we were thinking in terms of what is not used in the manifestation of a network often, and how can we make use of that. So the very straightforward implementation of a network would be to just connect a few nodes and have them exchange something like information or money, whatever. And that's what most networks tend to want to achieve. We were interested in essentially kind of saying, okay, what is left out? When this happens, there must be something that is left out and some sort of byproduct that we can maybe leverage. And mycelia by design work very much like that. So they facilitate processes that involve byproducts of other processes. And kind of digging more into that, we started to see that in a way, the way that those networks function is very similar to how networks of people would function, specifically because we were, of course, interested in networks of artists or art related networks so trees that are networked together, they tend to promote, like the soil becomes more fertile under the trees. It's not just the tree is happy, it's like that the soil around them is also happy. So in a way we're thinking, like very clearly in a way, artists that live in cities that have strong cultural representation, I mean, that's basically what an artist offers to their surroundings and to where they are. It's this sort of ambient culture. And I was then still in New York, so I was very much thinking along those lines.
Yeah. How do you take some of this abstract thinking, or what is the relationship for you between this abstract thinking about, say, ecological systems, forest and its structure? How do you begin to translate that into a technical system that you're thinking about, or systems design that you're thinking about? Like where does what is it sort of inspiration, or how do you translate that, those like high concept ideas into the building and thinking through of a concrete network or a technical network?
Yeah. When you kind of want to leave the more theoretical plane where you talk about metaphors and ideas that do sound really engaging, and you have to kind of, say, okay, proof of concept, something, how about we design and test something? That transition is always where you often have to simplify things in your reasoning, or you have to kind of start from something very specific. And I think that is what we tried doing, and that is in turn what kind of led us to the need offer machine. I think very quickly we realized that we need to think more, we need to identify what is a variable and what is a constant, basically. And from that, also identify what we're interested in changing or investigating or exploring. So essentially, what do we want to design for? Because we could not possibly come up with, we very quickly realized, actually everything is so context specific that it does make a difference if we're talking about a community of artists that is, fine arts trained artists who paint. Versus a community of digital artists. Usually also those two communities might not necessarily talk to each other a lot. So through this iterative process, it was always like, okay, so what's the ground zero, where can we start? Who is the person that would actually benefit? It's as if we were kind of chasing a storyline or trying to write a storyline around a persona.
Do you think that element of narrative, and even greater in the sense of language, like how you talk about what you're going to do, really shapes what comes out of that design process? Is that a very strong relationship that you think is really important? Or is it sort of, it really comes to bear once you're actually making? And
Yes, I do think that specifically words are important, but also it's not just words, it's I guess the references that you structure and you create for yourself. A lot of times I feel like I do, at least personally, I rely a lot on precedents and on references in other people's work. And I feel like often when I try to create a storyline or a sketch something, even it doesn't need to be designing an intervention. It can just be sketching an interface or something. I do think that there's usually a couple of things you do that tend to predetermine which way you're gonna go. Like not predetermine, maybe prime is a better word. I remember thinking about this when we were investigating mycelia and the trees. I was thinking, well, I know a lot of people from my community of artists and technologists who are really interested in ecology and networks and alternative networks. But it's mostly given through a lens of cybernetics, which is a very valid lens. But I guess when it becomes the only primer, then you kind of tend to create work that falls very much along those tracks further down. So yeah, I definitely think that more holistically in my practice that paying attention to what happens in the beginning of an idea or a project, or like how you create it so that it opens up or closes down from the beginning, I think it's important.
That's interesting in relation to one of the topics I've covered with a number of the DEL participants, and we have reflected a lot on it at Artengine about, when we published the call and when we put a framework around what we thought people would be doing in the Digital Economies Lab, we certainly had a very technology first kind of tone, maybe, or at least we threw in a lot of buzzwords to try and drum up excitement. But a lot of what happened even before the pandemic was a kind of a reaction to that, or it seemed like a reaction to that framing from the participants to shift towards thinking about the human components first, and not just as a kind of design approach, but really thinking where technology is an issue and how do we rethink that from an entirely different perspective. How do you feel about this? Like, how did you navigate some of those complexities between, a sort of technology first versus human first, if I can create that false binary?
I think the answer to that is it's very hard to disentangle those two. And at least my personal take is that nothing exists in a vacuum, and so technology does not exist in a vacuum. I think that we were all very aware about the things that can go wrong. We were definitely more on the dystopia flavor of the spectrum. And I still am there towards that side. But I think what could help and what I try to ask myself. And I also think it helps my design actually, which I don't think a lot of it's not unrelated to my design, as I wanted to say, is asking who will use what I'm about to make. And I think that like thinking about that, not just saying, oh, well, someone will use it. Yeah, okay. Like, but why or when or who will, and also like who will not use it, who will be excluded from this technology. Especially that question is, I don't think anyone who has been creating software or maybe even design in the last 20 years probably has asked that.
I think that it's interesting how we think about inclusion and exclusion. And I wonder how you think about it as a designer, because I know we often, exclusion is a negative and inclusion is a positive, in a very general sense. But, we do have to or want to create people that we are trying to serve, target, participate. In order for any group culture to exist, there has to be an outside on which the inside is predicated upon, right? Any community group, any organization has an outside and an inside. And if, that idea that if everything is everything, well, then it's nothing, right? So how do you think about, and maybe particularly through the lens of the project in its early phases, how do you think about this idea of inclusion, exclusion? If we didn't frame it that way, if we thought, well, who is participating, and how do we have artists participate so that they are welcomed and the focus?
I think for me, and we kind of got there rather quickly through our process while working on it, it has to do with what's the trust model within the community and who shares that. So for me, whoever shares it is part of the community, and whoever doesn't is not. But that obviously is a very hard, it's very difficult to define that. You usually identify its boundary, but you cannot say, oh, it's like, yeah, people need to speak like this and wear these clothes and really be very good with Photoshop. All these things are true. And maybe there are communities where that it's easier to define the like shared values than other communities. But it's always very difficult to design to just design around a set of shared values, which I think in a way, I think that software does that. And that's why often software is very problematic, because the binary thinking is something that's very useful for software, but it does tend to spill over in the decision making and a lot of things around software. So when you have the list of things that you think are important and you create something for only that, it always ends up backfiring in a way. And I think the reason is not because you design something trying to please a certain culture or a certain community, however you might conceive of it. It's because you think that you have the ability to design for it. I think that building uncertainty or like building ways that a software or a design model or an interface can fail or just admit it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing is something that globally neither design or software has done. I mean, obviously I don't need, the plane to be like, okay, I guess I'll just fail.
Yeah.
So it is, I guess, a bit more context specific.
But it depends what that kind of intention of the system is, which I
Yeah.
think is something really interesting that you guys were trying to think through, is how to build the foundations of a system that would allow for this and encourage a way of being together. I wonder if we could touch on, you mentioned these shared values, but the kind of complicated space between values as a like a systems of belief and value in this monetary idea. We brought the Digital Economies Lab participants together to think through this entangled space of economy, and an economy in that broad sense that involves values and valuation and all of these rich and complicated problems. For you, how did you think about value in relation to this project?
It's always, I think, as is common to other artists, thinking about value or money. Sometimes it's like, oh, I should not think about this, or like, it shows that I care only about money, or that something is wrong with my practice because I do it only for the money, which I think that throughout, at least, especially the first, like the 3 days we were all together, I think it was clear. And Jeremy was very instrumental in that, it's not a bad thing to want to be paid. And for me, I think that an artist creates something and they should, receive some support. I don't know if it's from the state. I don't know if it's from private donors. Maybe I don't care, but I think that they do create something that is shared by everyone. So in a way, it's almost like it's a public. So I wouldn't mind paying, raising taxes and me paying more as someone who's consuming, or obviously in Canada, things are way better than the US in that context because the state does support more the artists. I think I'm trying to keep. It's hard for people to not think of money when they think of value, and maybe my problem is more with that, which has nothing to do with the art. I think it's capitalism. But I think there are other ways of receiving, like feeling like you got something that is useful to you. So for example, I would go to shared co-working space or community space that has a fabrication lab. If I could access the fabrication lab for free, I wouldn't mind not being paid for the digital art I create, or for an exhibit that we host at that place, for example. But I mean, obviously I don't, as with many other participants, I also don't do this full time. And I'm pretty sure I would have a very different opinion if it was only reliant on that sort of income.
When you guys were in these early discussions of thinking through this, some of these value questions, did you think of this paradigm between, say, like, we want a system of exchange for artists that would help them survive in a kind of fit under the capitalist system, or one that is decidedly anti-capitalist? Was that a discussion that you had?
Like, when we kind of got more into the specific projects, for us it was, and actually what ended up being the need of a machine, it's very much an exchange of something. It's not a currency. It doesn't have a monetary value or numerical value, but because you think it equals the effort of someone else, then you're willing to exchange it. I mean, yeah, of course, I would love to overthrow capitalism any day. But I unfortunately, I don't know how. I don't know how art would exist in that post-capitalist world, because if you think about it, a lot of art has been very, very close. I mean, art has always been very, very close to money, in its very literal sense. And we would be talking about a very different consumption of the art world, basically. Which I'm all for having that discussion, but I think it's gonna be a long one.
Well, I think is that part and parcel a bit of a different position around a project like this, where it's maybe about eroding some of those components as opposed to fighting against them, but thinking about offering up incremental and interesting ways and alternatives to the ways things are being done in order to foster the kind of networks of care that are needed within a cultural community.
We all say we hate capitalism, we are against it, whatever. But I think it's hard to sit and think in what ways you actually are part of it. And I think, for example, the way we immediately, our minds think of money every time we kind of know we owe someone something or someone owes us something. The fact that, the word value has been almost made a synonym of money. That is a very, like, the essence. Kind of trying to undo that would be huge. But like actively saying, okay, maybe it's not money, maybe it's like 1 hour of something totally random. Like, I don't know, you are an artist and you have a kid, maybe it's 1 hour of me babysitting your kid because you want art. Obviously the specifics of that and like how do you make sure it's an equal thing to whatever, that's another story. But I think understanding that we don't necessarily need to think in terms of money, in terms of trade as a monetary, like financially, as a financial, I guess, in the financial context. But also like all the other things that come with being in a capitalist society, like comparing ourselves, working ourselves to the ground, or like thinking that if you're not poor or if you're not really tired, then you're not a good artist. There's all these, they seem to be side storylines, but I think they're very core. They're actually very much to the heart.
And you mentioned this, the hour, and I know that that's something that the project was thinking through this as a unit, and it sounds like a bit what you were trying to do was a bit like separate the monetary value that we put on an hour, and have users begin to think about an hour as a unit. But that's not necessarily related to like how much would you be paid for that hour, but how would you like to fill an hour, and what would you be able to offer for another in an hour?
Because exactly, like at the end of the day, it's an hour of, if we think in those terms, and I'm not gonna suggest that a doctor should think in those terms, for example. Like, if you want to have an operation, you should have the entire 3 hours of the operation. And it's 1 hour. But again, in the context of a community or like a group of people that have agreed, okay, for us this is true, then what difference does it make if it's me or you? It's still 1 hour human who seems to think along the lines of every other human in this community. And yeah, we're kind of trying to get to what has this been done with? Like, essentially, we the per hour salary is a very common, like everywhere in every country. And yeah, I cannot remember the details, but I remember looking it up, like the history of how did we end up paying people by the hour. I'm pretty sure it has to do with really ancient times, and like the army basically as do many things. But oh yeah, like even I guess, yeah, soldiers that are paid by not their own country to fight, which is kind of insane in a way. Like, what, who thought of that?
There's a lot of problematic histories if we look back into wages. That'll be a rabbit hole, that a darkness that we'll have trouble emerging from. But which is, I think, what I find interesting about that, and kind of like embedded in it, is there's some sense of subjectivity of time as well. Like there's a sort of like objectivity of the unit, like an hour of time. But the idea of trying to build a system around how we might, what kind of things we could give to others, where 1 hour of that for us is actually kind of either a joy to give, or simple to give, or easy to give because of a built-up embodied knowledge, which means that hour would be a completely different experience for the receiver.
That was I guess, the point where the project really started morphing into the need of a machine. Because we were thinking, yeah, it's so powerful when someone, like my partner, he's an architect and he's really good with, Rhino and all the 3D modeling software. So obviously 1 hour of him doing that and 1 hour of me doing that, not the same.
Yeah.
So in a way, we're thinking, wow, the scaling, when you have a constant, which is 1 hour, but you have the immense knowledge and skill that someone who really delves into the details of something, like artists do, like it's exponential how big of a difference that can make to someone who needs it.
Thinking more broadly about infrastructure, I think you were already very interested in infrastructure before you came into the program. As part of your training was to think about technological and web infrastructures. How did your thinking about infrastructure change and morph throughout the program, or how has that been? Because we brought together a group of people to really think through cultural infrastructure. How has that been over the course of the year in your thinking around infrastructure?
I have to say, because I think I'm the only, well, not right now I'm in Canada, but when I started, I didn't know what's going to be in Canada.
Yeah.
And it kind of still blows my mind how, compared again to the US, how supported, or I guess not totally frantic, the other participants were. Because I think, again, in the US, which many things are more exaggerated, there's no way I would have been able to be part of a program where people were discussing, okay, we have this funding and we are pretty confident that the support from the Arts Council and the government will actually be there. What can we do? Which feels so open and positive, exactly as it should. I'm sure there's problems, obviously, like everywhere, but I remember thinking that, yeah, it felt very different from the US model, where, especially again in New York, you have to work your contacts and there's a very strong gallery, obviously, system, and there are opportunities, but they come in very different ways. Nothing is supportive, almost, it seems like. And I know that in Europe it's more like Canada. It depends on the country, but in many countries in Europe, the arts are not as of a hectic sort of arena. Honestly, I'm still impressed by that. By how good, and like it felt to me that people could have a decent living, or maybe not, the most lavish of lifestyles, And then I remember thinking that I was also impressed by the discourse around indigenous art, and the fact that we were very, all these things were very new to me. They still are. And yeah, I remember thinking, wow, people here, at least they're not feeling like they're being chased by something, which definitely felt like in New York was the case. Even though I do think that being chased makes you run, and when you run, maybe you create something great.
Well, I think, you know, speaking from the Canadian perspective, especially, you know, growing up through through and emerging in like the cultural environment, but always having exchanges with American organizations and artists, and I think prior to the last year, not just the pandemic is a huge, but also the last few years, a rising consciousness about trying to, you know, bring reconciliation to some kind of a better place in Canada with the Indigenous peoples, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of that rethinking notions of care and solidarity. I think some of that intensity that maybe used to be enviable from the outside in America, of that running that you spoke of, seems suddenly very tiring once again, and that this idea of really deepening the safety net that is around cultural practice. How do we, and that's the question, I think that's one of the big conundrums, it seems like, how do we manage maintaining the safety net and fostering innovation at the same time? And maybe, you know, people like yourselves who are moving between the two spaces will be able to cultivate insight there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very good question. I have a sense that in smaller countries / communities, like I was actually thinking of the Netherlands right now, where I know that there's, again, like Canada, quite a lot of support, but they're very small. And it's just much easier to think of yourself as to like be, you know, collaborate with many institutions, or also Switzerland, where I've lived before. I definitely think that nothing sustainable, especially when it comes to like reconciliation with, you know, tense concepts like the indigenous population and its role in Canadian culture and society. You cannot really resolve things unless you feel supported. So I think that, and for example, I don't think that's happening in the US.
So back still on the question of infrastructure, as a designer and technologist, you know, how is that part of your practice changed over these last few years? And even before the DL, I know you were attracted to some of these ideas of changing and thinking differently about design, but certainly change has come in rather forceful and all-encompassing ways over the last year.
No, of course, I still am interested in rethinking and creating. Well, I think I operate in two modes. There's a mode where I go through phases where I have time to read and kind of look at other people's work. And when I do that, then suddenly things just come to my head. But there's also this other mode where some days I wake up and I'm like, oh, I had this great idea. And then I try to either design it. Usually I work doing both design and software. So if I want to create this software that does X and Y, usually I can kind of conceive of how it will look, and I can also program it. So for me, that's like a sprint. In the past months, I feel like I've been able to operate more like that. I think when I was at the lab, because of the environment, because you have more I guess it's a more of an academic place. I read a lot. Often I feel like those two things are kind of in tension with each other. Whenever I read a lot, maybe I'm not making as much, and whenever I make, I don't read a lot. I am wondering how the last, I guess, year, I have been wondering, okay, how the way what I make and the way in which I share it matter to me, and how can I, especially in the context of what's going on in social media, but also questions of authorship and things like that. So I am still trying to figure out, okay, do I just create things and release them and tell people on Twitter, or do I put them on a website? Do I try and apply for residencies or like some sort of show? I still have not found the right answer. I do think that it's project specific though. And I mean, the question of networks and how can our current tools be better, and how can I help promote critical conversation? I think I will always think about those things for sure.
This has been a great conversation, and we're as we sort of draw to the end here, maybe can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now or where you're headed next?
Yeah. So for the last, I guess, year, yeah, I've been interested in gestures and computers. So basically interaction, but in this very elemental way. So clicking, scrolling, dragging. And in a way, I'm asking myself, okay, what can I make with this like very simple? First of all, it's really interesting that the way we use computers and interfaces is still governed by the same rules that the people who first designed them came up with, which maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. So in a way, okay, what if scrolling was behaving in a different way? Or what if a browser, which I usually prefer to work on because I think it's such a powerful window into so many things. What if a browser looked completely different? Or what if the desktop metaphor just doesn't exist anymore, and we can conceive of computing in a very different way. So like personal computing. And that usually takes the form of small, I guess, executables. I create like this small software that you can install on your computer and just pops up a window where the default interaction behaves very differently. So you try scrolling and something else will happen, or like you try clicking and you need to click in a specific way. Or for the browsers, I've been curious on whether people can make their own browsers. So basically, this already exists. There are open source browsers. But more specifically, I'm interested in how the interface. So the the verticality, I guess, the feed. I think a lot of things in the last 10 years that a lot of 10, 15. So think of social media. They 100% depend on scrolling basically, or swiping up and down. So what if that didn't exist? What would Facebook do? How would the feed? I was thinking, what if the feed was like files on your desktop? That would be so stressful. Which then brings me to the question of like, okay, what am I doing and how am I sharing it? Which, yeah, I still don't have an answer to, but I just enjoy the exploration.
That's great. That sounds like we could start a whole other conversation just about feed and speculate on what it would be like if we didn't have feeds in our life.
In such a new development.
Yeah, the endless stream, and that is a curse and a blessing.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing some of these experiments soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
There we got an actual bye-bye. They actually left. They have a meeting in like 8 minutes.